All right, attempt number 2, because I was a dollop head and recorded my fat face instead of the screen last time, so we're gonna give this another go. All right, so here's where we left off last time. You can either download the week 3 or the week 4. The only difference between week 3 and week 4 is that I will have all these nodes laid out for you, and you will be able to export the different passes individually. But that's what we're going to go over right now. So if you have week 3 and you just want to go through this yourself, you can. All right, jumping right in, I'm going to go over to the right-hand side. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to put a vertical split in. I'm going to create a new window doing that, and then I'm going to go over and change the new window to the compositor. I could just go over to the compositor tab, but I actually want to see what's going on in my scene while I do this. You're not going to see anything right off the bat. That's because we have to put on the nodes. So go up and click Use Nodes. I don't really know why this is off by default, because I don't know how you composite without any of the nodes anyway, but it is, so you're always going to have to turn that on. So I'm just going to delete the nodes that are in there. I'm going to start this off from scratch. I'm going to add in my own render layers. So go ahead and place that, and then I'm going to add in a file output node. And this is how we're going to render things out. Up until now, we've been rendering out everything through the render tab. We're going to render out our layers through this file output. I'm going to drag this node all the way out so I can see the full file path. I'm going to go ahead and open it. I'm going to make a new folder for my renders to go out to. Maybe make a subfolder for this one and call it text. I'm going to go ahead and accept that. I do have to add a little bit to the name here. I'm going to go ahead and add text with an underscore in it. And that's going to name the files. Remember, we're making an image sequence and EXR. So each of these individual files are going to be named text, underscore, 1, 2, etc. So now we actually need to make up the render layers that we're going to output here. If we go down to our render layer node, it's going to say view layers. And that corresponds to this name up here in the right-hand corner, this view layer. So let's go ahead and rename that. We're going to rename it text. And with text, I'm going to put in everything that's metal. My text, my rings, all those rods flying around, everything that's metal, I'm going to group together in that one. So I can go ahead and keep on everything that I don't need, and then I can turn off everything that I don't need. This is the advantage of putting everything in collections. We can just simply turn it off. It won't render. Now, there are going to be a few exceptions to this. So if I go up to this filter tab here, there's an option called holdout, and turn that on. It's going to create a cutout of anything that's overlapping so we can place it over top again. So if I have something like the Comet that goes in front of the text and then behind it, I'm going to have a really hard time compositing those. With a holdout, it's just going to cut out where that overlaps. If I do this correctly, it won't matter how I put my layers together when I get into Fusion. I'll just be able to plug them all in. They're just going to fit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for my Comet. I'm going to do it for, maybe the atmosphere and the stardust and anything else that I think might be overlapping with my text at some point. As you can see with the Comet here and the stardust, it's creating a cutout. It looks like it's blue. It's not. It's actually just transparent so that we can place that layer into that hole when we render that one out. So now I'm going to plug in my image output to my file output. I can hit N on the keyboard to bring up my side menu. Hit N if it's not there. I can click on this properties drop down and I can see some of my properties. If I go over to my view layers, you can see all the different passes that we can put out. There's the combined, of course, which is just everything. You might want the diffuse or specular. That's going to be your lighting. Volume for like the atmosphere is going to be volume. Emission, of course, we made the timing rods have a glow on them, so they're going to have an emission layer. And you can see as I turn them on, they start being added to the render layers. And if I need to add them to my file output, I can just go up to my little menu here, make sure I'm on file output, not the render layers. I should see options similar to what we have for this. So I can add in a few different outputs. I'm going to rename image to RGBA because it's the color plus the alpha of everything. I can also add in the diffuse color, the diffuse direct. So I'm going to do that real quick, and then I will explain a little bit more after that. All right, so now I have all my passes and I can just plug them right in. But you're probably wondering, how do I know which passes I need or which ones are even present? To do that, we can go over to our view. Remember, we have our shading and our render view. If I click this little arrow, there's a drop down, and now I can choose different render layers. So we have an emission here, we have environment, there's my diffuse. If I click on my diffuse light, you can see that nothing shows up. Same thing, if I go to diffuse color, there's nothing there. So I don't actually need those passes, I can just disconnect them. And the way we're going to do this is we're not actually going to use any of these passes anyway. The reason you might use these passes is if you have a character or model that has some complex lighting on it and you want to tweak that a little bit in post. We're just going to export the RGBA for all of these. If you want to duplicate this, you can go ahead and grab it, hit Shift D, and then we can put a different layer for like our environment. And I can just go up in the corner, I can click on copy settings, and I can create one for the environment. And since I'm copying it and not making it new, it'll have all the outputs the same as the other render layer. And then I can just change that to environment. For this, I am going to use the image output as well, but that's going to be for the glass rings, and I'll explain that in a second. For my environment, I need to turn it off so that's not rendered out with all my other layers. So if I go underneath my render tab, I can go down to film and I can click transparent and that'll turn it off. Let me just show you. I'll turn it back on and turn it back off. This is so it won't render out with everything else, and then I can render it out in the environment layer. So we don't have a collection for the environment. It's just going to render it out as it would with like a shadow or a glossy pass. And like I said, I am going to use this image pass for the glass rings. And the reason I'm doing that is because if we change the color of our background, remember our rings are supposed to be transparent, so I need my rings to change with my background. I will get to be able to adjust them separately, but I just thought it would be good to have it in the environment as well. It just makes more sense. And of course, I'm going to make the text a holdout because I want to color my text separately. Now, the things with the rings is that the text seen through it is baked into the ring. So if I change my text, I can't change the text inside of the ring, if that makes sense once I render it out. There is a workaround with that with Fusion, and I'll show you when we get to that part. There is another problem, and you can see it here. Remember all that text that we made transparent? Now we've made it a holdout. And just because it's transparent and we can't see it, doesn't mean it's not actually there. And so it actually gets put in as a cutout. The way I ended up fixing this is once it disappears, I just animate it to move off screen out of the camera. That's the easiest way I found. So just be aware of that. If you see weird artifacts like this, it's your invisible text that's no longer invisible. It's a cutout. Okay, so here's the finished template. I put in all these different layer passes just if you wanted to use them. Again, I'm just going to render out the RGBA. But I left in the relevant ones in case you wanted to experiment. Now you may notice a couple of these are dark, they're muted. So if I highlight something and hit M, it becomes dark and muted. It means it's not going to render out. I may not want to render out everything at once. If I just wanted to render out one thing, I can go ahead and highlight all of them. I can hit M to mute them. And if I go over to the layer that I want to render out, I can click on render single layer, and then I'll just render that one layer. If I want to render out a few different ones, I need to go ahead and go on the ones that are muted that I don't want. Make sure use for rendering is turned off. It shouldn't render if it's muted, but I have run into that glitch where it will actually render something out. So just uncheck that and then make sure that's turned on for the other render layers that you want. And make sure that none of them have use single layer on. Otherwise, it's just going to render that single layer that it's turned on. One other note is you don't actually have to render out the entire range. Something like the Comet or the atmosphere, once the camera gets past it, we don't need that anymore. So I can set my frame range from like 1 to 500 and I just render out that section. Once it's off screen, I don't care about it, but I did render out the full thing for our purposes for when I did it myself, just because I wanted the clips to line up. And one other quick note, since we're rendering out with these file outputs, make sure on your render that we don't have a path there. Delete that path. That's the path we've been rendering out the whole time. If you leave that in, it will render out that as well. So we don't need that, so delete that path. We're going to render out through the paths that we put in our file outputs. All right, so here I am in Resolve. I'm just going to go ahead and drag in my folders. You can see I got lots of bins here, but don't worry about it. You can just drag in your folders. It'll read it as a file sequence. If it doesn't, go over to the media page, drag them into this media pool here, click on these three dots, and change frame display mode to sequence. That'll ensure that every time it sees like an image sequence where the files are 1, 2, 3, 4 in a sequence, that it's going to read it as a clip and just line them all out together. So if you're having trouble dragging in your files, make sure you look at this and make sure that that's turned on. All right, back on the edit page, I'm going to go ahead and go to effects, and I'm going to drag on a fusion composition. Now it's set to 5 seconds by default. I'm going to change that. Right click, go to change clip duration, and I can just type in 40 seconds. Remember we had 1200 frames, we had 30 frames per second at 1200 frames, so that's 40 seconds. And to make sure my timeline's playing back correctly, I can click on this little cogwheel and make sure that it is indeed set to 30 FPS. After that, I can just go to my Fusion page here, click on that. Now all I'm going to have in here is just my media out. And I can go ahead and open up my media pool and just drag all these in. Now it's going to be black. And why is it black? Well, because if we click on it and we go to the inspector, we can click on channels. All these channels are blank. The way we fix that is we just add in our channels. So here for the environment, we have our environmental red, our environmental green, blue, our alpha, and now you can see that it appears and it's being displayed almost correctly. We'll fix that in a second. Also, make sure you change the name on these and you don't just have everything set as media so you don't know what anything is. Go ahead and hit F2 and you can rename it. So we'll go ahead and rename it environment and dust. And now I'm just going to drag in all my other clips and I'm going to change their channels and then I'm going to rename them all. So I will be back in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and fix the way it looks. You notice that it doesn't look quite the same way as it does in Blender. If I go back to Blender, you can see it's a much brighter blue. In Resolve, it's much darker, and that is because of color space. I'm not going to get into color space a ton because that's a whole nother video, a big video, and I'm not going to do it here. But enough to say, in Blender, it's actually outputting in Filmic. What is Filmic? I don't really know. In Resolve, we have it in Rec 709. So there's going to be a brightness discrepancy. The easy way to fix that is if we go back to Fusion, I can hit Control Space to bring up my little toolbar, and I can search for a color corrector or a brightness contrast. I'm going to put in BC for brightness contrast. I'm going to add that in, and I'm going to put up the gamma to like 2. And now if we compare the two, you can see that they match pretty closely. And so that I don't have to do that on every single one, I'm just going to move that brightness contrast to the end and then plug in all my nodes before it. That way that'll apply the brightness contrast at the end over everything. So I can go ahead and grab these little squares and I can start plugging them into the environment and it'll automatically create a merge. Now because we did all the holdouts correctly, it doesn't matter which order I plug all these in. Once I get them all plugged in, you can see that they all fit nicely together and I don't have any weird holdouts or anything overlapping incorrectly. Now I am missing one element, and that's the glass rings. And remember I said I exported it with the environment. So what I need to do for that, just to show you how render layers work with the other passes, I'm just going to duplicate that. And then I just need to change those channels to the rings. And then once I plug that in, you can see it fits perfectly. And now that I have everything in there working, we can start making a few adjustments. So just to show you what I mean, let's go ahead and add in a color corrector, hit Control Space and put in CC, that's the shortcut for color corrector. And I can move it to something like yellow or reddish, and it changes the background. Now here's where I was talking about with the rings, because the rings are blue. Now we are seeing through the rings blue, and maybe you want that look, I don't know. You should make the majority of your adjustments before you render it out. This is more for small tweaks, but we can also adjust that color. So if I move the color corrector, I can put it after both of those and it'll apply to both of them. Now they look correct, but our text, because it's baked into that ring, like I said, it doesn't look right when you're looking through it. I mean, maybe you want that yellowish tint, maybe that's good enough, but there is a way to get around that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to apply a mask to that and key it out, and that's how we can fix it. So let me show you how I fix that real quick. All right, so here I have the rings and I'm just creating a separate layer for the text. You can see I split off here. I used a delta keyer to kind of isolate the rings and text. And then I used a luma keyer to basically isolate the text itself going in that ring. And then I applied the same color corrector to that. So the end result here is I'm using the same color corrector as I am over on my dissolve text so that the text inside of the ring looks similar to the text that's outside of the ring, if that makes sense. And obviously this is an extreme example. I've changed the background a ton. I've changed the text a ton. If you want to make a big change, do that in Blender before you render it out. Again, we just want to make small changes here. Maybe the color's just a little bit off and we want to correct it a little bit. But this is how you can get around that text looking different. And then you can, of course, color correct it to match a lot better. All right, so here's the portion for a few tips and tricks in no particular order. There are a few things that will come up when you're doing this. Remember when I said that the holdout issue, my solution was to animate them to move off? Well, I moved them off too quickly and sometimes you get errors in your render. There's an error here where right when it disappears and right before it moves, that last frame, it pops back in. My solution to that was to slow the speed down. I was just having it go from 0 to 5 over the course of one frame. So I slowed that down to 5 to 10 frames where it's moving after it becomes invisible, just to smooth that out, and it seems to have fixed that problem. So another one is the reason that we did the RGBA pass instead of all these other layers is that it gets a lot more complex with the other layers. The other layers don't actually have an alpha channel. So you can see here I have a side by side. One is my RGBA and the other is the combined glossy and glossy direct. All your passes combined should look like your RGBA or your beauty pass. And they are, except for a few things, namely the alpha. You can see there's no alpha there. So the only two ways to really get around that is to subtract this from your beauty pass and then put them over top, and then you get the alpha from the beauty pass. It's kind of a mess. And the other option is to just have everything be a holdout on the environmental layer. So it cuts everything out of the environment, and then the environment fits nicely in all those empty spaces. I didn't want to do that. I thought that was a bit much. So we went for the easy route. But this is the kind of problem that you're going to run into. You can see that the Blender document actually says that other than the combined pass, you're not going to get alpha out. So just remember, you're going to have to do extra work if you want these extra passes out. The other thing is motion blur is not output on these passes here. It's not a big deal. You can add it in later just by adding a motion blur node, and it fixes the problem pretty easily. You can see that I get these two looking pretty much the same, but it won't render out motion blur unless you're doing the combined pass. All right, so that should be everything for the template and compositing. Let me show you how to actually change the template in an easy way. I'll run through that real quick. There's only a few changes that you actually have to be aware of. All right, so here is the week 4 final template. One thing I didn't think about was you're probably going to have to re-render the fog and the particles. So to do that, you just have to make sure you go down to your domain for the atmosphere and make sure you bake it again, because it's baked locally on my machine right now. So you just have to redo it on yours. Shouldn't be a big deal. And then remember to go to your Stardust and your Comet and make sure you go to those particle settings and go to bake and bake those out as well. As far as the text goes, it's pretty easy. You're just going to click on it. You're going to hit tab, and then you can change it to, whatever you want. Then hit tab, then you can back out of that. For the final text, for the text dissolve, what you're going to do is you're going to find your text. Remember, we have 2 of those on top of each other. I'm just going to find it. I'm going to hit tab, change it to whatever I need it to be. I'm going to go ahead and grab that old IMAX mesh. I can delete that and hit Shift D and duplicate my final text. Hit escape so it doesn't go anywhere. I can find it in my menu. You're going to see the duplicate there. Just go ahead and rename it like dissolve. Right click on it and then convert to mesh. And then go ahead and add a particle system. And all you need to do is just add in that dissolve particle system and you're all set. And you see it's dissolving, the particles are flying. Make sure you go back to the first frame of that particle simulation so that they will behave normally. And that's basically all you need to know for dealing with the template and changing it. Of course, you can grab the rings and anything else, change the materials, change the keyframes, and do whatever else you want to it. So that'll wrap it up for this video. Next time, we're going to go over how to create this counter in Fusion, and then I'm going to show you how to combine everything and do this transition. Thank you for watching, do some dabbling of your own, and we'll see you around.